Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a legislative briefing with Representative Jim Walsh from the 19th Legislative District. We're hosting these briefings in an attempt to get constituents to have time to talk to their state representative about some of the big policy debates and decisions that are taking place in Olympia on state budgets, emergency power reform, public safety, and many, many other topics. Every Saturday at 4 p.m. throughout the 2022 session, Representative Walsh will host this live meeting to meet with you live and answer your questions. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Representative Jim Walsh. I do want to remind everyone, though, that we are recording this event. It will be posted later on Representative Walsh's website if you would like to watch it later. And I do want to inform you that you will be recorded as you ask Representative Walsh questions. I want to thank everybody for being here. If you would like to ask the question of Representative Walsh live, all you have to do is raise your hand during this event. That raise hand icon is at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, your name will come up and I will call on you to ask a question of Representative Walsh. So Representative Walsh, you can take it from here.
Thanks, Kelly. Welcome, everybody. This is the second of our series of Zoom-based town halls during the current legislative session. This is new technology and it's a new approach, and we are still kind of testing it, but I welcome you here. And the idea of these town halls is to talk about policy and talk about budgets and talk about the things that the legislature is doing in Olympia in real time, so that I can answer questions about things as they're happening. And where we stand now is we're basically at the midpoint of the legislative session. What we had last week, well, earlier this week, a few days ago, was what they call the policy cutoff. Bills that have to do with new law or revising existing law had to have had their hearing in their committee of origin by this week and be on the run list to be voted on the floor of the legislature in order to make a scheduled cutoff. If a bill didn't get through its committee hearing and vote by Thursday, a few days ago, it's considered, dead, not proceeding during this legislative session. Now, I always put an asterisk on this discussion. All of the deadlines that we have during a legislative session are rules, and there are loopholes, and there are parliamentary ways to get around the deadlines. So truly, any bill that has been filed can find a way to become law up to the last day of the legislative session. So as they say around here at the Capitol, no bill is ever really dead. Nothing is ever really finished until the speaker's gavel drops on the last day of the session. But the procedural deadlines are generally true and generally reliable. And if your bill that's pure policy didn't make it through by the end of this week, it probably is going to have to wait till the next session to try again. The exception there, of course, and one of the main ones, is the budget bills, and any bill that is directly related to one of the state's three budgets: operating, transportation, capital construction, is not finished yet. Those bills are ongoing and will be for several days and even a couple of weeks ahead. So if a bill is tied directly to one of the three budgets, it gets a waiver from the policy cutoff. And this weekend here at Olympia, a couple of the budget committees have been meeting, going through the bills they have that are directly related to budgets. So the activities go on. I think what I want to do is turn to questions pretty quickly, because I want to know what you want to hear about, and I can blather on forever about procedure. But Kelly, as we did last week, I know a few listeners have submitted questions in writing. Let's start with one or two of those to give everyone a few minutes to get settled and on board here, and then we'll, if we can, we'll go to the live questions after a couple of written ones.
All right, that sounds great. I'll go ahead and start with some of these pre-submitted questions. I do want to ask one question of you right now, Representative Walsh, before we kick off some of these pre-submitted questions, and that is, you're aware, and I'm also aware, that we can't talk about campaigns during.
Oh, right.
And could you explain to the listeners why that is important and what those ethical lines are?
Sure. That we do get some questions pre-submitted, and I know people want to talk, real politics and about specific campaigns. We can't do that here. This is a function of my office. Kelly Payne is my public information officer. Carrie Dodson is my legislative assistant. This is an official function of my office as a state legislator here in Olympia. We can talk policy, we can talk budgets, we can talk anything related to the legislative work, but the ethics rules of the legislature prohibit me from talking about campaigns, about specific candidates for office. And I think it's understandable. It makes sense, that ethical line. Basically, we are doing this with taxpayer resources. Your tax dollars pay for the office I'm sitting in at the Capitol and for the staff that's helping me put this on. And we don't want to use a forum, a venue that tax dollars are paying for to talk about politics, partisan politics, or campaigns. So that makes sense, and I can't answer those questions. Excuse me. I can talk about them, of course, in other venues. If it's not being basically funded with taxpayer dollars, I can talk a little more plainly about campaigns and politics. But here, we focus on issues and budgets and bills. We can talk about all day long, but we don't talk about specific campaigns or individual candidates. So I hope everybody understands that and sees the wisdom in not using a channel paid for by tax dollars to talk about politics.
So the start of this legislative briefing, Representative Walsh, you mentioned the budgets. This is a supplemental budget year. There's 3 budgets that need to be approved: the operating, transportation, and capital budgets. And this year, Washington State has an unusual problem. They have too much money.
Right.
So I want to talk about some of these pre-submitted questions. There's several that have to do with some meaningful tax relief being offered to Washingtonians this year. Is that going to happen in your estimation? Do you think it's possible for some real tax relief to get out to people?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's true to where we are right now. The economy in the state of Washington has bounced back from the COVID lockdowns and shutdown period better than people expected. Sales of Washington-based businesses are back up. The tax revenue that the state collects, which it primarily comes from 3 sources: property taxes, sales taxes, and then the business tax that we call B&O, business and occupation tax. There are other forms of taxes and fees the state collects, of course, but the 3 big ones are those: property, sales, and B&O. Those have all come back faster and stronger than the economists and the financial gurus had thought they were going to. As a result of that, we do have a budget surplus in Olympia. Now, we calculate our budget surpluses or deficits, when we have deficits, in a couple of different ways. And remember the 3 budgets, but we take a total of the 3 budgets. We look at forecasts based on existing tax receipts, the money's coming in from property taxes, sales taxes, and B&O taxes. And then we project the amount of tax money that the state is going to collect, basically in 3 term scenarios, an immediate scenario, which just looks at the coming year or year and a half, a midterm scenario, which looks more at about a 4-year time frame, and then a long-term scenario, which looks at about a 10-year scenario. So we do projections based on 3 different time frames. And that's why if you read in the paper or hear on the radio or watch on TV, you'll hear different estimates of what our surplus is. You'll hear some estimates that the surplus is $1 billion or nearly $1 billion. And that's the short-term projection. So the projection for just about a year ahead puts us at just under $1 billion over what we're spending in the budgets that we've established. It's about 900 million, the projection for the short-term surplus. If you look at the longer term, that term, which is more like 8 to 10 years, the surplus is much larger, of course. And that's why you may hear people saying that there's a surplus of over $10 billion, or something in the neighborhood of $12 billion. And that's the longer term projection. Both are true. They just look at the time frame differently. So what we have in this situation is on our current budget, we're projected to surplus for the rest of its lifespan an extra 800 or 900 million, almost $1 billion. And so what do we do with that money that's going to come in above projection, above what we projected and budgeted to spend? There's a great debate about what to do with it. Some of my colleagues don't want to return it in any manner to the taxpayers. They want to use that money to pay for more services, pay for more things. I'm on the side that believes we ought to give taxpayers some kind of break. There are a couple of ways we can do that. That in some states, the state is able to actually issue a refund, a check to taxpayers if they collect more than projected taxes at the state level. Oregon is one that is able to do that. The existing law and practice in Olympia and in the state of Washington doesn't make that easy. It doesn't exactly prohibit it, but it makes a rebate difficult to do. So that's not practical. But what I'd like to see is an adjustment, particularly in the property tax piece. Property taxes, sales taxes, B&O business tax. I'd like to see a relief in the property tax leg of that stool. And the thing about that is property taxes, whatever you do, if you adjust property taxes, if you lower property taxes or raise them, property taxes are kind of slow moving. If you adjust them now, if we were to reduce property taxes a bit because our tax receipts are coming in ahead of plan, the reduction doesn't take effect immediately. It kind of cycles through and takes 6 months or a year to begin to take effect. But the good side is a reduction lasts longer. Once it does take effect, if you lower the property tax calculation, it stays in place for a longer time, and that's a good thing. Unfortunately, not many of my colleagues agree with that as the priority. Most think because it is longer lasting, they don't want to reduce property taxes. And the current governor has indicated he does not prefer that strategy. What some have suggested instead is a tax holiday on sales tax. That is, we would either lower or eliminate the state's sales tax for a period of time, encouraging people to go out and buy things and spend money because they don't have to pay the state sales tax when they buy something. That is the shortest life span tax relief. It takes place almost immediately. I mean, you don't have to pay the sales tax in real time. And it also ends quickly. The proposals that we've heard are really short. The tax break on sales taxes in Washington would be maybe 3 days or maybe a week. And then it would be over and we'd be back to the taxes, sales taxes we pay currently. So I'm not keen on that, exactly because it is not a real sustained tax break to taxpayers, to working people. There's some discussion too about cutting the B&O tax or lowering it. Right now, that B&O tax, that business tax in our state, is calculated in a very complicated process where each industry group, depending what industry type the business is in, pays a slightly different B&O tax, a percentage of their total sales, their total revenues. So it's a top line tax based on total revenues of a business. And then the percentage number that they pay for the B&O tax varies depending what industry they're in. So some legislators have suggested maybe flattening that variance, lowering the B&O tax and making it closer to the same for every business, regardless of what type of line of industry you're in. That's interesting. That might be an interesting middle ground. It doesn't help individual taxpayers that well, though. It does eventually, because if you give the businesses a break, they eventually pass their lower costs on to consumers who buy their goods or their services, but it's not a direct form of relief to an individual person or family. So these conversations are happening. Will any of them take place? I don't know. I'm afraid the one that's most likely to take place is that sales tax holiday, because it doesn't cost the state very much, and it's over quickly. But we will continue pressing the governor and the majority legislative leadership to do something, to give the people of Washington some form of tax relief, because they've overpaid. They deserve a break. And in the longer term, I'd like to change our law around how we collect taxes here so that the state could issue a refund the way that Oregon and other states do, where you would literally get a rebate, a refund check from the state government in those years that our tax receipts, the amount of tax we collect, is in surplus, is higher than what we projected. When that happens, I think you ought to get a check back for your part of the overpayment. So I hope that covers the basis pretty well. Kelly, do we have another written question?
We sure do. I just want to remind all of the attendees, if you'd like to ask a question live of Representative Walsh, please use that raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, I will call on you in a couple of minutes and you can ask your question of Representative Jim Walsh. Representative Walsh, one of the other questions pre-submitted was, what power do the legislators have to stop the Pierce County Health Department from setting up vaccine verification program?
Oh, vaccine passport. Well, some, but not as much as you think. The current law and current administrative code at the state level gives local health departments a great deal of power in implementing public health policy. More power, I think, than some people realize. By comparison, the state health department, the State Department of Health, is largely a kind of figurehead organization. They can make recommendations and suggestions, and they can produce administrative code. They can produce WACs, Washington Administrative Code, but they have relatively little enforcement powers. What we call the local health officials, the local health departments, in most cases, the county health departments, in some cases, it's a city health department, but those local health authorities have more enforcement power than the state health department does. And this normally comes to a point when we're outside of the COVID world, where the county health department can shut down a restaurant, for example, if the restaurant doesn't pass a health inspection, if it's not clean enough and hygienic enough. The health department can close that restaurant down until they get their act together and clean up their kitchen or clean up their place. The local health department can shut down any public place if it believes that there's a risk, an imminent risk to public health. They can shut down a store, they can shut down a school. And So the county departments do have a great deal of authority. In the case of these vaccine passports, or what is diplomatically, bureaucratically called a vaccine verification, counties can try to set those policies up, and we know that a few have. King County has, Jefferson and Clallam counties have. Jefferson and Clallam County out on the Olympic Peninsula, they share one health department. So the health department there decided to implement a vaccine passport system. As I understand it currently, Pierce County, and this is the question from the viewer, Pierce County has also a joint health department. It's between the city of Tacoma and Pierce County, where the city of Tacoma is. The city and the county share a health department, and that health department has implemented what I believe is still a voluntary vaccine passport system. I don't believe they've mandated it yet for restaurants and public spaces. On the other hand, King County and that joint Clallam Jefferson County, they mandated that all restaurants, bars and pubs, places where people eat, have to demand a proof of vaccination for people to enter those places. As I understand it, that Pierce County's is still voluntary, but to the question of what can we do in the legislature to change this, the most important thing we should do is adopt policy, that is, pass a state law that bans vaccine passports. And we have several different versions of this. I authored one. Other legislators have authored others, and they are filed, and they're in the system here in Olympia, that would say that no local government or state government or any other government entity can mandate vaccine passports on individual businesses and people anywhere in the state of Washington. And that is all that is required there is a simple bill. If the bill passes, then these local county health departments, who still have a lot of power for enforcing public health policy, would not be able to do that part. I am determined that we do put that into state law, whether we get it this session, which we will probably not, or a future session is the only question.
All right, we're going to go to a live question right now. Again, I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, you can use that raised hand icon. And right now we're going to go to Richard. Richard, you are live and you can ask your question of Representative Jim Walsh. Are you there, Richard?
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes.
We can hear you, yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim, for this access, as well as providing your staff to make this happen. I really appreciate it. So I'm a little out of touch perhaps, but I would appreciate if you could summarize in a fairly quick fashion the top and enumerate for me the top 3 bills currently in session that may or may not pass, and enumerate them 1, 2, 3 that impact or may impact conservative values in District 19. Thank you.
That's interesting. Well, it's no secret that I would put at number 1 a limit on the governor's emergency powers. I've been pushing for that for years. I think that is a major constitutional problem that we have in the state right now. The current law allows the governor to declare a state of emergency and leave it in place indefinitely. And so we are in the situation now that we are, where we're in 2 years and going into the 3rd year of a declared emergency over the COVID outbreaks. I guess the most important constitutional and conservative policy point to restore constitutional balance in government would be to get a day limit on that declaration of an emergency. That is a clearly stated time limit on how long a declared emergency can last. My bill 1029 put the strictest limit on it. It suggested a 14-day limit on a declared emergency. On the other end of the spectrum, the Senate bill 5909 allowed for a 90-day limit. It also was very soft in other ways, so it was sort of a soft 90-day limit. So that's kind of the frame. On the one side, you've got 14 days, kind of strictly defined. On the other end, you have 90 days, kind of loosely defined. And then a couple of other bills that are in the middle that suggested a 30-day time limit or a 60-day time limit. As I've mentioned before, the most, I guess, strongest or the most likely of those middle bills is House Bill 1772, which would put a 60-day limit on a governor's emergency. And I could support that bill, even though it's more than I would grant. It's pretty clearly written, which is a good thing. And while I'd like the deadline to be shorter than 60 days, at least that bill clearly states a 60-day limit. So that's certainly an improvement over what we've got. So, Rich, I would say that's number one, limits on the governor's emergency powers. Second, I would say some reform of the recent reforms on law enforcement, our law enforcement policies in the state. As you may know, or other viewers may know, last year and a little bit the year before, so the last couple of years in Olympia, we've passed a number of bills into law which have been very bad for law enforcement agencies. They have restricted very severely what law enforcement agencies, your local police department or a county sheriff's deputies, can do to enforce the law. There are a bunch of issues in that. The original bills that were problematic it was a group of about 8 bills that did different things. The two critical pieces is that these bills redefined how a law enforcement officer, frontline cop or sheriff's deputy, can pursue a suspect or a criminal, and limited it pretty severely. And that's why you're hearing stories or reading them in the news that law enforcement agencies around the state are in situations where they can't give chase to a suspect in a crime. We need to reset that one. The recently passed law that makes it very difficult for police to chase a suspect needs to be recalibrated, basically, in my opinion, set back to the previous standard so that they can use more discretion and judgment when deciding to chase a suspect. The other one is limits that were put on the ability of law enforcement officers to use reasonable physical force, that is laying hands, touching people, moving them, in situations where they're trying to de-escalate other violence. So imagine a late Saturday night bar fight where the police are called, or a domestic violence situation, a fight in a home where they're called to try to calm down family members who are fighting. That recent bill limited the ability of an officer to lay hands on somebody where there's either violence happening or the threat of violence about to happen. And I think we need to give back some of that discretion to the law enforcement officers to use reasonable physical force to de-escalate a violent situation. That last one also affects people who are having mental health problems, mental health breakdowns, and are in the middle of the street screaming incoherently. Police are now very restricted in the ability to put hands on that person and put them into a squad car or just walk them off the street over to the sidewalk. They have limits on how they can literally touch that person. And so we need to return that discretion to law enforcement. That would be the second thing. And then the third thing, I think we need to look at some of how we are implementing K-12 education policy in the state. I am deeply concerned about what is being taught to our K-12 kids, especially our K-8 kids, especially the primary school kids, and things that they're being taught about their country and about the history of this place, this state, and this nation. And I think we need to clarify what we want to see in how kids are taught about their state, their country, their place in it, the systems of government and society that we have. I put forward a bill that shouldn't have been controversial, but turned out to be, House Bill 1807, that laid out a framework for a curriculum of civic education for all K-12 students, but it focused particularly on K-8 students, kindergarten to 8th grade. And it set out a priority for how at each level of their education, they should be taught about civics, about their government and their history. And it turned into a very controversial bill, though it shouldn't have been. It was perceived and characterized as anti-critical race theory, which is a hot issue right now in education circles. It was a little bit touched on those issues, but really it was mostly about, not about that, it was mostly about what we want to see in a healthy civic education of our kids. So, but that became very controversial. It got a hearing, but not a vote in the legislature. So it's stuck for now. It's one of those ones I talked about that got caught in the cutoff deadline. But it's an issue we will come back to because we haven't had the last debate on what we teach our kids and how we teach them about our country. So I would say those are the three: executive powers, police powers, police policy, and K-12 education. I would cheat a little bit maybe and say there's a close fourth in some of the tax policy we've talked about, the possibility of cutting some of our taxes, but you asked for three, and the main three are those, I think.
Rep. Walsh, we're going to go back to some pre-submitted questions. Again, if anybody would like to ask a question of Representative Walsh, just click that raise hand icon. This pre-submitted question you kind of touched on already because it has to do really with emergency powers reform. But this submission says, now that Europe is dropping the mandates, when will Inslee do so right here in Washington state?
That's a good question, and that is kind of the offshoot of the more general emergency powers question. The way that the governor has used these emergency mandates is terrible. It's unconstitutional. And I'm referring to the state constitution primarily when I say this. As I've said before, if you think of these emergency powers and emergency declarations, the emergency declaration itself doesn't do much. But what it does is it acknowledges a problem and then opens a toolbox of extraordinary powers that the governor of Washington has during that period of a declared emergency. So the emergency declaration itself is one action that a governor takes. And then the governor is able to do a bunch of other things kind of under the cover of the emergency declaration. And that's where we have this set of proclamations, emergency proclamations that the governor has. And this governor has misused those emergency proclamations in a really aggressive way. And this is what these mandates come from. They take the form of emergency proclamations made under the rubric, under the control of the emergency declaration. The emergency proclamations are policy made by a governor without the consultation of the legislature or the courts, acting as an individual, that can either create new policy on a temporary basis or waive or suspend existing law on a temporary basis. It's very powerful stuff and frankly dangerous when in the hands of someone like the current governor. And what the governor has done, he's done both things. He's waived existing law and he's also created new policy, temporary, but temporary is years long at this point. So with these emergency proclamations, which are kind of like executive orders, but a little more powerful during the declared emergency time, they are a page, maybe 2 pages of a written kind of memo that by which the governor creates policy, creates a new policy. One that's been in the news lately, of course, is the mandate issued on schools, on K-12 schools, that students in public schools have to wear masks inside in classroom time all the time. This was done in a complicated dance. It was partly based on recommendations made by the state health department, partly based on recommendations made by the superintendent of public instruction, who works at the state's office of the superintendent of public instruction, OSPI, but all of it coming from the authority, the emergency authority of the governor. And it's been in the news lately, that one, because kids around the state are starting to revolt. They're starting to protest and refuse to wear masks. And if they're removed from classrooms, they are standing protest outside the school, and they're taking action. I just recently spent some time in the town of PL, which is in Lewis County, and is soon to be part of my district, because we've recently gone through redistricting. And the kids there at the small school in PL have been protesting, and it's a very small school, so it doesn't take very many students to protest to put a real crimp in the school's operations. And these kids are really remarkably well informed. They know about their constitution. They know about how the governor's powers work. At least they know some of it. And they had a good sense that this mandate on wearing masks in the classroom isn't law, which is true, it's not. And they had a sense that this was a kind of an abuse of the emergency powers that we want to give the governor. So I was very impressed with what's going on down there, and it's happening in other places too. If you've watched the news very much, you've seen that there are similar student protests in towns like Washougal and Woodland, and all around the state. So that's a good public reaction to an abuse of these emergency powers that take the form of these mandates. We probably can move on to some of what's going on with some of our school districts. I know I've heard from many parents who talk to their school boards and their school superintendents locally in whatever place they live, the town they live, or the county they live, and are hearing from the superintendents of school boards that they are bound by the mandates of the governor. And this just isn't true. The school boards have broad discretionary power and can set policy, whether it has to do with kids wearing masks in class or hiring and firing their teachers and other employees, on what they want to do. They can, a school board can set its policy that may not agree with the governor's mandates or with the superintendent's priorities. They are independently elected, independent entities, much like a city council and a mayor. But the current belief at many school boards is they are bound by mandates from the governor, and they feel intimidated by threats made by the superintendent of schools at the state level that he will cut the money, he'll cut budget resources from a school district that doesn't follow the governor's mandates. And this is a horrible abuse. The superintendent of instruction should never be in the situation of threatening to cut money, taxpayer money, that's designed to go to the schools around the state. It's upside down. The superintendent is supposed to be an advocate for school districts, and to be threatening to cut their money off, it's just bad policy. It's like mafiosa tactics. And I'm trying to encourage the local school boards who are dealing with questions of mask requirements or of staffing to stand independently. But it's been tough going. They are many of them are intimidated by the governor and the superintendent. And that's just not a good place to be in. They shouldn't feel intimidation from elected leaders. They should feel support.
All right, we're going to go to a few more live questions. Darla, you are live on the air with Representative Walsh, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Darla.
Well, it's actually Jeff.
Well, hi, Jeff.
Yeah, it's my girlfriend's Facebook.
Okay, that's fine.
Anyway, my question is, doesn't or didn't Inslee and
The superintendent or
Well-
the attorney general?
no, Biden, didn't they have to swear an oath to protect our Constitution? And now that they aren't, isn't that an impeachable offense?
Oh, that's a good question. We've looked at impeaching. The governor can be impeached same way the president can be. Impeachment, in fact, it's the thing that should happen, in my opinion, if a governor or president acts really badly. Impeachment is not a criminal thing. Impeachment is simply the process by which you get a governor or a president who's been elected out. And it works like a trial. Basically, the House of Representatives, either in Olympia or in DC, are the lawyers, and the Senate, either in Olympia or DC, is the jury. And so the House puts together the articles of impeachment. That's like the lawsuit. And they take it to the Senate, where they make their case. And then the Senate votes on the articles of impeachment the way a jury votes in a trial. And if the Senate impeaches or convicts of impeachment, convicts the president in DC or the governor in Olympia, then that executive is removed from office. It doesn't happen often, and it's not really meant to happen often, but it can happen when what our Constitution here in the state says for Olympia, for the governor, is if the governor is involved in crimes or misdemeanors or acts of misfeasance or malfeasance. And misfeasance and malfeasance can cover a lot of ground. There is an argument to be made that the current governor has, even if he hasn't committed crimes or misdemeanors, has acted with misfeasance or malfeasance. And Jeff, to your question, violating the terms of his oath of office would count as that, at least. I mean, it might count as more, but it would count as misfeasance or malfeasance. Some of his policies, I believe, count as misfeasance or malfeasance. Certainly, the lockdown and the financial economic damage that did to the state would count. And some of the things he's done and said, his efforts to shut down free speech in the state, I think count. And some of what I talked about a minute ago with the school boards, where they feel intimidated by the governor, that's misfeasance or malfeasance. Anyway, we could assemble articles of impeachment against this governor. The trouble is, those of us who think constitutionally are in the minority in the state legislature. And in order for articles of impeachment to go forward, we would need to have a hearing, and they would need to be voted out of the House of Representatives in Olympia. And right now, the current leadership, the current Speaker of the House in Olympia, not in DC, in Olympia, wouldn't even give articles of impeachment a hearing. I mean, she would not allow articles of impeachment even to get to the House of the floor of the House in order to get to the Senate. So it's a non-starter. So it's a political issue, I suppose you could call it that. But impeachment is designed to be difficult. And I'll add, there is a recall process in this state. And the recall operates outside of the legislature, so it's different than impeachment. It's a public thing. It's structured similar to an initiative. So you have to collect signatures. You have to go through a process like an initiative to do a recall. But a court in our state, in Washington, a court has to clear the recall petition before signatures can be gathered to get it on the ballot to vote on. This is different than other states. In California, for example, where there was recently a recall vote, The recall goes forward first, and the court rules on its legitimacy later. Here in Washington, the court gets that review right at the start. And there was recently an effort to put together a recall petition, and that failed at the court level because the court ruled that the recall petition was not strong enough to stand up to scrutiny, to court scrutiny, if it were successful. So the fact that in our state, you need that court decision on a recall at the beginning of the process makes the recall difficult to do. So we have these tools, Jeff. We have a recall option. We have impeachment that we can do, but they're difficult to pull off, especially when the legislature is aligned so closely with the current governor. It's very difficult to get articles of impeachment off the ground. And that's kind of where we are right now.
All right, we have another live question from Barbara. Barbara, you are live on the air with Representative Walsh, and you can ask your question. Are you able to unmute, Barbara?
Yeah, you're still muted. Oh, there we go. We're getting some feedback on your connection, Barbara.
I'm sorry, Barbara, we weren't able to connect you to Representative Walsh. There was some feedback on your audio. We're going to go to Laura. Laura, you can now ask your question live of Representative Walsh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. No feedback here.
Representative Walsh, thank you and your staff for this town hall. I wish that Governor Inslee would have town halls like this. My question is about the rights of private religious schools, such as Christian and Catholic schools, to cease masking children. I've had several conversations with our private school principal about all the reasons to unmask school children. She says that her hands are tied. She says that Governor Inslee will shut down the school if they don't follow his mandates. And she says, you don't want to deprive the children of being able to go to school, do you? And then she also says that the Department of Health will shut down the school if cases increase to some unknown number. No one can say what that number is. I printed off the RCWs for her about private schools. And as far as I can tell, those RCWs say that private schools are independent. Are you able to help me out with this in any way, or give me some more information about the rights of private religious schools in the state of Washington?
Sure. Sure. You're right on the mark. Private schools, religious or otherwise, don't follow under the oversight of the superintendent of public instruction, not directly anyway. Generally, in order to be accredited, and most want to be accredited, they have to show that their curriculum, their methods of study are in line with standards, state standards and national standards. But they don't have to answer to the superintendent as directly as public schools or charter schools do, which do get their money from the state. So that's a good thing about a private school. It's independent. And that's just common sense. The governor has no direct operational policy control over what a private school does. His mandates do not apply to them. But where the principal you spoke with is more valid in her concerns is, again, the local health department, that is your county health department, I assume county, it could be a city health department, wherever you are, can shut a school down just the way they can shut a restaurant down. But they can't do it viciously. A health inspector would have to have reasonable cause to show that there had been there was a health risk. If there were an outbreak of COVID cases at a school, and there is no law or even clear administrative code that says what that is, as you already mentioned in your question. But if in the judgment of the local health authority, there was a health risk, a health danger to health because of an outbreak, they could close the school down on health grounds. That is a more, I guess, realistic concern of your principal. But as I say, there's no clear standard in either the law or administrative code over what that risk would be. And as we get to the tail end of FAR's curve, of the epidemiological curve, the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, that curve, it becomes less and less likely that there would be the kind of outbreaks that would get a private school crosswise with the local health department. But I should say this too, Laura, with regard to restaurants that are facing health department issues, sometimes the biggest risk is someone snitches on them. There'll be a private complaint made about, and this has to do more with restaurants, about a restaurant, sometimes coming from a competitor restaurant, that will get a restaurant in trouble with the health department. And I've spoken with some parents in my district and who are worried that that's what would happen. If the private school allowed masks to be taken off, someone might complain about the private school to the local health department. And then the local health department would come and inspect and harass the private school to the point of having to shut its doors or having to send the kids home or something like that. So this is the trouble, Laura, with where we are. When we live in these kind of lawless times, when the governor disrespects the constitutional law of the state, we end up in these situations where an angry person can phone in an anonymous complaint about somebody and get them in trouble with local, magistrates, local health departments. I would suggest talking to your principal and simply making the reasoned case, and that the mask rule should be loosened for kids at the school. This is a current issue. I mean, what's happening all around the state with kids walking out of their classrooms if they're forced to wear masks, I think that is a reality that principals and school administrators and even the governor is watching. And I think it's a proof in a real practical way that the people are finished with these COVID lockdowns and mandates. And even the kids are finished with it. They don't want to wear the masks anymore all the time. And I think that movement, that protest among students, among kids, is gaining critical mass. More of them are complaining about these policies that they don't see as effective. And they're right, in my opinion. So I would talk to the principal and say, look at what's happening all around the state. You aren't in direct, you aren't controlled directly by any governor's mandate. Yeah, the county health department could come around and give the school a hard time, but we're not likely to have that kind of outbreak because we're on the tail end of the curve. FAR's law, the great observed rule of how these viruses work through populations. It's time for a change, principal. Let's loosen the rule. If a kid wants to wear the mask, the kid can wear the mask. But if the kid doesn't want to wear the mask, if they feel better, if they learn better with the mask off in classroom, make it optional. Let the kids decide, and maybe let each teacher decide. Make that case. And if the principal doesn't respond, wait a week and make it again. I think time is on your side.
Rep. Walsh, it's hard to believe, but we're at the end of the hour. We have time for one more live question. And it looks like this person doesn't have a name. It just says Galaxy. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you want to go ahead and ask your question now of Representative Walsh.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
Can hear you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Jim, for meeting with us and being so available and responsive to our questions and concerns. We appreciate it. My question is really a global question, but I do have a specific example for you. The example is the bill, and I apologize, I don't know the bill number, but it's the one that criminalizes free speech of politicians if they were to allege that there was an unfair election process. And the committee voted it out onto the next step to the governor's desk. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was that there were an overwhelming amount of public testimony with concerns about this bill. It was clear the citizens did not want this bill to go forward. And I was just wondering, my question is, at what point does this violate the ethical obligation of these legislatures to vote for bills and legislation that the citizens want instead of pandering to the governor? Because I think that's certainly the perception at this point, is that they're putting through bills and legislation that the governor wants at the expense of what the citizens are asking for. And we've been very involved and they're just ignoring us. So that's my question. Thank you.
Oh, it's a great question. It's a terrible, terrible bill. It's a Senate bill. It's Senate Bill 5843. And it is literally a request bill from the office of the governor. So there's no chance that the governor can try to claim, dodge responsibility for it. It says it right there on the bill that it was by request of the office of the governor. The governor can do that. The governor can't file a bill, can't submit a bill, but the governor can write a bill and then ask a state senator or representative to file the bill. And this happens fairly often, not as bad as this one, but it does happen. And when the governor or the attorney general or an elected official statewide asks for a bill, it will always say by request of, and then the name of the officer. So this one, 5843, says by request of the office of the governor, and it is absurd. It is flagrantly unconstitutional. The constitutional protections for free speech and for what the state constitution calls freedom of conscience, which is kind of a halfway spot between freedom of religion and freedom of speech, all are covered by Article 1 of our state's constitution, are stronger, in my opinion, even than the First Amendment protections in the US Constitution. The Washington State Constitution, very strong on your freedom of speech and your freedom of conscience. And clearly this bill, slapped together by the governor's office, violates those constitutional protections. It is what they call a message bill. I don't think that the governor seriously expects this just stupid bill to get through the process. I mean, maybe he thinks it will, but I think it was mostly meant to send a message. Again, a kind of intimidation. It's no secret that he ridiculed by name 3 of my colleagues. I was not one of them, but 3 of my colleagues for, I don't know what they attended a seminar he didn't like. And he named them and said that they were creating, undermining democracy and all this overblown kind of hysterical rhetoric. They questioned the 3 of my colleagues, the 3 legislators. They were questioning some of the actions around the 2020 election, but they didn't incite riot. They didn't call for violence or anything like that. And so this bill he's put together is just, it's stupid, it's silly. And it's a waste of time. He did find a group of state senators, his close allies in the state Senate, who put their names to it. It's worth noting that the prime sponsor of it is a state senator who has, I believe, announced he's retiring. If not, it is widely speculated that he's retiring. And that may have had something to do with his willingness to put his name on this bill. The governor claims that the bill is narrowly drafted. It is not. The governor claims that he has opinions that show that it would be constitutional. It would not. It's just, it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. And it given what this governor has done for the past 2 years in abusing his emergency powers, it shows a real tin ear. That is a real dullness to meaning, to image, to messaging. After abusing his emergency powers for 2 years, to submit a bill like this to the legislature shows just a kind of dullness about how this comes off. This is not something any governor especially this governor, should be promoting. So that's where we are with this. What can we do to stop it? Well, I mean, I think the best thing to do when you have, especially on free speech issues, the best thing to do when you have speech issues is just add more speech. I mean, the way we defeat Senate Bill 5843 is to just open it up to ridicule. Read the thing, tell people what it says and what the context was of these personal attacks on legislators that the governor made, and just shine a light on it. Talk about it, say how bad it is. I do believe that the cure to bad speech is more and better speech. And I think this is a place where we're going to win that skirmish just by talking about how bad this bill is. I don't think we're going to get satisfaction on this kind of abuse as long as the current governor is governor. He has shown that this kind of behavior is part and parcel of his approach to governance. And he has his supporters. So, he listens to his supporters. And I just think that what's happening, and I'm optimistic that most people don't go for this kind of thing. Most people, even people in the middle of the political spectrum, even on the left side of the political spectrum, they value constitutional rights and constitutional protections. And I think, we're at a place where all reasonable people, regardless of their political, beliefs and political orientation, all reasonable people want our constitutional protections to be guarded. And I think this bill slapping down free speech, it's a bridge too far. It's too much. And I think that there's going to be a public response to it in a positive way. I think it's already happening. The way people are reviewing this bill and rightly criticizing it is a healthy thing. And all of you who logged on, who clicked through to the links on this bill and stated that you were against it, all of you had a hand in doing that and in speaking the public voice against this kind of bill. And I thank you for that. That's very useful. We've seen similar things happen with some of the gun control bills, very strong opposition to those. We've seen it happen with some of the education bills, a little more split on some of those issues, but we are seeing good participation by people in some of these online hearings that are going on in venues just like this one on Zoom. So I'm encouraged by that. And people ask me all the time, is it worth doing it? Is it worth going on the internet, clicking through the website, dialing in the number, finding the bill and pressing the I'm opposed button? Is it worth it? And I say, yes, it is worth it. Because it does give a voice to where the people of the state are. And even if it doesn't get every single bill knocked down, that's a bad one, or lifts up every single bill that's a good one, I think in the long run, getting involved and taking a few minutes once a day or once a week to chime in on what you think about what's going on in Olympia and bills you've heard about, I think it is worth doing. And I'm so thankful that thousands of people oppose this governor's bill limiting free speech. That was an incredibly healthy thing. It's like the kids in PL and Washougal who are protesting the mask mandates. This is healthy democracy. And not everybody's comfortable with it, but that's the way it works. Not everyone is comfortable with true, vibrant democracy. But that's a good thing. That's a healthy thing. So thanks for that question, and thanks everybody for calling in. We will continue to do these weekly online town halls. Tell your family and friends, anybody who cares about what's going on in Olympia. We will continue to do these on Saturday afternoons, and I look forward to doing more of them and hearing from more of you. And they will follow roughly this format. We'll start with a few written questions and then go to some live questions, and they'll last about an hour. And I think I'm enjoying talking to all of you. I think we'll continue to do it. Kelly, we have any last technical matters?
Yeah, I think you covered everything. I just want to remind all of the attendees that the link that you have will work for every Saturday. So if you use that same link next Saturday, it'll work the week after and the week after, all throughout the 2022 legislative session. Representative Walsh, thank you so much for being here. And I, again, want to thank everybody who asked a question tonight and everybody that listened in. Hope to see you back again next week. Thanks, everyone.
We'll be here again next week. Be well, have a good week, and I'll talk to you soon.